cheap. Auto paint is not cheap. Stuff. Pro Street would be everything a customizing body shop would do, minus the $800 spray gun, minus taking the panels off the car, and minus the spray booth. Part 1's all about the body and prep, and part 2 is all about painting. And this is a multi-stage paint job where you have 2 base coats. First you have a sealer coat, and then 2 base coats, and then a clear coat, and then the chrome trim that I'm restoring too in a whole separate different videos. Yep, we got some work to do. The first thing you want to do is take this chrome off. And I have a separate video that I'm working on restoring this chrome. Although, you know, if you're a good internet shopper and you surf around, you could probably get all 3 pieces of this for less than $100 bucks. So while it's not cheap, it's also not super expensive, and restoring it is an awful lot of work. So there's a line here where I'm doing a pro street level restoration on this bumper. But, you know, you don't want to go super cheap on everything. So, I mean, if you just go out and buy Krylon chrome spray paint, it's going to look terrible, and it's not going to be restored, and you're not going to be happy with it. And you can wind up shaving in the chrome that I'm restoring. It's like a mirror. This chrome is not molded metal. It's fake chrome sprayed on top of a combination of rubber and plastic. So it's bendable finish. So I don't want to waste too much time on this chrome. The point is you have to take it off. And when you're taking it off, try to keep the glue with the actual chrome piece, because it's easier to get off the back of the chrome than it is to get off the actual bumper. Procrastinated on this bumper for a long time, And the big question I have is, how far do I want to take it? Do I want to do a street level job, or do I want to take it all the way and do a pro custom job in a spray booth? I did auto body work for a long time in California, and I know the can of worms that I was potentially opening. So it kind of stopped me where, I didn't want to spend $1,000 on this bumper, but I also, didn't want to do a crappy, spray paint job on this. So, I mean, this bumper is more complicated than most of them because you're dealing with three colors. There's a bottom color, which is dark brown, and then there's a top color, which is gold, and then there's the chrome trim. So it didn't help that there's about 200 levels in between crappy street level job and professional custom job. Do I want to take the bumper off the car? Do I want to build a temporary spray booth? Where am I starting and where am I finishing? How much money do I want to spend and how much time do I want to spend on it? And now that the car is back on the road, I didn't want to drive around with a patched up, horrible looking bumper on a beautiful car. In other words, I wanted to get it done as fast as I could get it done. And that in itself would stop me from starting it. Do I have everything I need? How much is the paint going to cost? Where am I going to be getting the paint? And do I have all the tools? And it goes on and on. Sometimes the hardest part about any job is just applying yourself, committing yourself, and just get started on the job. And one day I was walking to my car to go out to work, and I just looked at it, and I couldn't stand looking at it, so it was like, okay, it's time. And I just grabbed a piece of 100 grit sandpaper and just started sanding on it. And that's the thing about the auto body, is the more you do, the worse the car looks. So I knew once I started cutting into it, I would want to get it done as fast as I could get it done. And that gave me incentive to start it. Take a good, long, close-up look at your bumper and find all the deep gouges, the scratches, any rock chips, and mark them if you have to. You're going to sand them with 100 grit sandpaper, but you're not looking to sand these gouges out. You're just looking to feather the paint around the gouges and create a surface where the filler is going to take hold. Some guys would say that 100 grit sandpaper is a little bit too coarse for this bumper, but we're not sanding the whole bumper. We're just kind of sanding into the gouges and the rock chips. And what you're looking to do is feather the edges of every gouge and every parking lot thing. If you take a good look at this bumper gouge, this here, the deepest part of this, that's just melted plastic that they place into a mold, and it comes out with a hard, smooth shell, and that's the yellow part around that gouge right there. And then if you keep sanding, so what you're looking to do is feather the edges of this. So that black that you see is the sealer that they first spray the bumper with. And then the gold is the actual base coat, and the clear coat on this car was long gone. So you're just looking for that layered feathered edge. And then we're going to start filling those scratches and gouges. And then we're going to replace the 100 scratches with 150 scratches. And then we're going to replace the 150 scratches with 220 scratches. And then we're going to replace the 220 scratches with 320 scratches. And then we're going to replace the 320 scratches with 400 scratches. And we're going to be filling the gouges and priming the gouges between each step. I'm using glazing and spot putty made by Bondo, and it's perfect for this application. And it comes in a tube, so you don't have to mix anything, and it just fills it perfect. So after sanding the area with 100 grit, you're going to clean off the area, and then you're going to fill it. And then the next step is to let this dry and you can go up in sandpaper to 150 grit. You want to make sure that your sanding strokes are a little bit longer than the strokes that you used with the 100 grit, because you want to feather those 100 scratches out. So each time you upgrade in sandpaper, you're just going to go a little bit further than the previous step. And eventually, by the time we get to 400, this entire bumper will be sanded with 400 grit to make sure everything is feathered out and perfect. And during this process, I spent a whole lot of time cleaning out this channel for the chrome trim. And that glue is really tough to get off, so I spent a lot of time scraping, but I'm not going to put a whole lot of that in this video because I just don't want to bore anybody to death. Just understand that it takes a lot of time and it's really tedious. And hey, now we're down to 220 grit, or up to 220 grit sandpaper, and remember, go a little bit longer than you did with 150 grit. You want to feather those 150 grit scratches out of there with 220 scratches. Alright, now that the first round of 220 is done, we're going to take a real good look at this fill job, and you can see by the red, dark red filler, we didn't do a very good job here. So all this at level surface is this pink. So we have to fill in those tiny little red gouges. And then when the filler is dry, we're going to go over it again in 220. We're not going to graduate to 320 until we get this perfect with 220. And now it's time to start priming just the spots that you've been working on. And if you look at this primer while it's wet and on the bumper, it'll give you a really good indication of what the actual base coat and clear coat is going to look like. But don't forget, we still have 320 sandpaper and 400 sandpaper to get to. So it won't look exactly the same, it'll be even better. You're just looking for those major gouges and scratches. You just want to get them out of there and filled, and the primer will fill the microscopic gouges that you can't see. And this tape job here is just, protecting that chrome and that headlight from the overspray. We're not real worried about exactly doing a great tape job at this point. As you can see here, once we get up close, there's still a whole lot of imperfections here. There's just a ton of scratches, and a lot more filler has to be applied, so we're just getting started here. We're going to put that filler right on over that primer, and then sand it down again with 220. By the way, I'm using a rattle can primer here from Rust-Oleum, and it's a primer filler, and obviously it's great. And I'm quite impressed with how well it works. The issue is you really have to shake this can up and get it rattling really good. Otherwise, it's going to come out too thin and it's going to run on you. So do some extra rattling before you actually use it, and I think you'll be impressed too. The top of this bumper was its own can of worms, and there was a lot of weather damage on this, and the clear coat had peeled off and was gone years and years ago, and that left the base coat, that gold color, exposed to all the elements, and after years of the sun beating down on it, it was just gone. It was almost down to the sealer coat. So all of that had to be feathered out, and I was still worried about it, so I tested the primer on it to see if I had it right before I went and put any sealer on or any paint on it. And this groove right here in this bumper is a natural dirt trap, and after many years, I mean since 1992, that's been accumulating dirt in there, so that took a while to get all that crud out of there. And then feathering this was just, it took a lot of time, and I had to go back to 220 grit just to get this all feathered out and smooth and to get all that dirt out of there, and then I proceeded to 320 before moving on to the rest of the bumper. And the top of the bumper was like this all through the top except for the sides. The sides were fine. Yeah, but the front top of this whole entire bumper took hours and hours and hours to get this right. And here we see an issue and another factory flaw. When they glued this trim in, the base coat was not exactly all the way dry. So what happened when I pulled that trim off is some of the base coat came off with it. And the problem, if you take a good look at this, the problem with this is water is going to get trapped up under there, and the entire base coat, if I paint over that, is going to just start peeling off eventually somewhere down the road. So I had to feather all this out and again go back to 220 grit before moving forward with 320. And then I tested it with primer to make sure this was actually sealed and it's going to look good when I put the base coat on. Even though nobody is ever going to see this, this is a problem down the road. And if you really want to do a good job, you have to get this feathered out so no water can get trapped up under there. And now that that's feathered and primed, we can go back to 320 and proceed with that driver's side part of the bumper. The driver's side of that bumper, that entire region throughout the turn and all the way back to the wheel well, is cut down to 320. There's no more scratches, there's no more gouges, and everything's primed and sanded down to 320. Before we go to 400 and then the Scotch-Brite, which would be the final step, we're going to go to the center region and repeat that entire process, and then we're going to go to the passenger side region all the way back to the wheel well and repeat that entire process. All the rest of this video will be in fast forward. I'll slow it down to the end and update you on where we're at, what we're doing for paint, and that will be an entire different video. In this center part of the bumper, we're going to be dealing with a whole lot of tiny rock chips. There's going to be a lot of filling going on here. And this right here is a factory flaw. It looks like a factory run right there. And these holes right here in the bumper, you see one there on the left, and then there's one there on the right. Those are, for some states, require a license plate in the back and the front. So if they're prepping the car for a state that mandates that, then they put that license plate rack there. And those holes are just, so they can line it up real quick, drill holes through it, and then put that plastic, connector there for the front license plate. We're going to be filling them because I think they look dreadful if you don't have that front license plate. right there was going to be the final tape job, and then I was going to just scuff it up and with a Scotch-Brite, a maroon Scotch-Brite, that's important, and then put the masking paper on and tack it and degrease and de-wax it again, and go ahead and start spraying the sealer. The problem is it rained last night. We're getting a little tiny piece of this storm down there in Pensacola. And, you know, the tape stayed on, but the tape created water traps, you know, between the chrome and the bumper and all those tiny little areas. So I'm going to go ahead and scuff it up and then take all the tape off and start over again. But first, you know, I got to let it dry out and everything, so. This is a problem with painting outside. You don't have to worry about this when you're in a spray booth. It's also a little bit windy, so even if it hadn't rained, I don't think I would paint today. And it's not the overspray that you're worried about in the wind. It's all the crap flying around, all the dust, and you know. So yeah, I mean the temperature, the humidity, you know, the wind, all these things factor in when you're, you know, doing a street job. It's a bummer, you know. Here's a serious issue that I've been worried about for a little while. This gun, I have so many things connected to it that, you know, the stem is so long on it. I have an air pressure regulator on it, and I have that white water trap right there. And because of that, it's gonna be, at best, it's gonna be awkward to get the underneath of this bumper. And that's just me getting used to the arm movement. But yeah, see, once you hook up the hose, you have to kind of cock the gun sideways. So I'm going to have to figure out another way here. once I get this masking paper on, this bumper is well, it'll be tacked with a tack cloth and then shot with a sealer. And by the way, I found out at the paint store that the sealer is dark gray, it is not black. And I'm going with Omni from PPG, and that's sealer, both base coats, everything to mix it with, the hardener for the sealer, everything, and the clear coat is all Omni. And I'll get into all the details of buying paint, mixing paint, how much you'll need for a job like this, and gun setup in part 2. I decided to go ahead and go for it on this day. The wind started dying down a little bit, and it seemed to be prime conditions for painting. It's exactly 70 degrees. I wanted to at least get the sealer on by the end of this day, and you can see the sun's going down, but that's okay. It doesn't take long at all to paint. Here's a few screenshots from part 2. Please tune into that. I think you'll enjoy it a lot.